Now that we've learned how to calculate elasticity, we're going to determine why knowing the value of the elasticity of demand for a firm is actually used as a useful tool. When a firm understands the price elasticity of demand, it allows them to know whether or not they should raise or lower their prices of the goods that they sell, whether they should charge different customers different prices, and even allow them to know whether or not they should charge different prices at different times of the year. All of this is related to the amount of revenue that the firm is able to make. In other words, the goal of the firm is to ultimately maximize profits, but we know that maximizing their revenue is a part of that equation. Therefore, they want to determine what price do I charge in order to maximize my revenue flow. And again, understanding the elasticity of demand allows us to understand that for the firm, and it'll allow us to know whether or not a firm should alter their prices in order to increase their revenue flow. Now, the reason they're able to use elasticity as a tool to maximize their revenue is because there's a close relationship between the price elasticity of demand and total revenue. So the formula for total revenue is simply price times quantity. So if you take the price of a good and multiply it by the units that you're able to sell, that will allow you to know what the total amount of revenue your firm is bringing in. If we look at it graphically, it's much easier for us to identify that close relationship between the amount of revenue that a firm is able to bring in and the price elasticity of demand. So what I'm going to do is give you a schedule of information with some different prices of goods and then the different quantities that are demanded at those different price points. So again, let's say that we have a good that can be $2, $4, $6, $8, or $10. And at the same time, we're going to observe the inverse relationship between the quantity demanded. In other words, as that price is increasing, the amount that we want to purchase is getting smaller and smaller. So here's a basic, again, demand schedule telling us the prices with the corresponding quantities demanded for a particular good. So what I can do with that information is come over here and plot the demand curve for the good. So again, we have price on this axis, quantity on this axis, and then take some time to go ahead and place the values on the axis. All right, so again, I can take that data and now plot my demand curve for the good. Connect those dots. And again, that is now the demand for the good. You'll also recall that we talked about elasticity of demand and how it varies along a straight line demand curve. So therefore, we know along this demand curve, demand is going to be elastic up here at the top. It's going to be unit elastic in the middle, and it's going to be inelastic down here at the bottom. So we already know that. Now, what we can also calculate from the information in this table is our total revenue, because we just saw in the previous slide that total revenue is simply price times quantity. And when we look at our schedule of information, we have that information. We have the price of the good and the quantity that's going to be sold at those different price levels. So what I can do now is just add another column of data here to calculate out the total revenue. So again, all we have to do is multiply these numbers. So 2 times 10 is 20. So when the price is $2, the firm will have $20 of revenue. When the price is $4, they'll have $32 of revenue. When the price is $6, they'll have $36 of revenue. When it's $8, they'll have $32, and then they're back down to 20. So what I can do now is actually calculate out my total revenue curve for the firm. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and draw another curve right down here, identical to the one that I have up there. with the same values, in other words, the different quantities that I could sell. But instead of having price on this axis, I'm going to do total revenue on this axis. So I can see what happens to my total revenue as I'm altering the price. So we know when the price is $2, I was going to sell 10 and I was going to be able to sell 20 units. So at $20 of revenue, I'm able to sell 10 units. Again, when I raise the price to $4, I'm then going to sell 8, and so my total revenue would be 32. So let's put 32 here. So again, when I'm selling 8, my total revenue is 32. When I'm set price is $6, I'm selling 6, and my total revenue is 36. So I come up here at 6 units, plot that point at 36. Then when I raise the price to $8, my revenue goes back down to 32. I'm only selling 4 units. And at a price of $10, I'm only selling 2, and my total revenue falls to 22. So again, I can connect these dots now, and now what I've plotted is my firm's total revenue curve. The total amount of revenue that I'm able to bring in at all the different price points that I'm able to charge. And what you see is that my total revenue first increases, then it peaks out, then it goes back down. So I can look at the point where total revenue is peaked out right here and see that there's no other price that I can charge that's going to give me a larger amount of revenue. And so that would be right here at $6. Also notice that if I pull that up to my demand curve up at the top here, that corresponds with the unit elastic region of demand, right in the middle of my demand curve. So what that means is that a firm will always maximize revenues where demand is unit elastic. So a firm maximizes total revenue when demand is unit elastic. So knowing that allows us to understand whether or not the firm should raise or lower the price in order to maximize their revenue. In other words, let's say that they currently have a price up here of $10. Well, we see that that is in the elastic region of demand, and if we want to maximize our revenue flow, we know we need to be down here in the unit elastic demand. Therefore, the firm should lower their price in order to maximize their revenue. At the same time, let's say that we're down here only charging a price of $2. Well, at $2, we're down here in the inelastic region of demand. So when demand is inelastic, you want to raise your price. So again, you start to see how understanding the elasticity of demand for the firm's product allows them to know whether they should raise or lower their price in order to maximize their revenue. They will always maximize revenue where demand is unit elastic. Therefore, if you do the math and you come up with a number greater than 1, that means demand is elastic, you should lower your price. If you do the math, you come up with a number that's less than 1, that means demand is inelastic, you should raise your price. All right, so now that we understand the relationship between total revenue for the firm and the price elasticity of demand, let's move on to something different. I want to talk about something called price discrimination. Price discrimination is simply when a firm charges different customers different prices for the same product. Now you ask yourself, why would a firm want to do this? Why would they want to charge 2 different people different prices for the same product? Well, it's simple, because a firm wants to maximize the total amount of revenue that they can bring in. So if they determine that 2 different people have different elasticities of demand, then they want to charge the unit elastic price to each one of those individuals or groups of people. So the conditions that have to be met in order for a firm to practice price discrimination is going to be 1, obviously, first you have to identify that there truly are 2 different groups of people that have different elasticities of demand. 2, the groups have to be easily identifiable. 3, the groups have to be kept from trading the goods with each other, because then that would defeat the purpose of utilizing price discrimination. And then, of course, number four, the fact that they're going to have different elasticities of demand has to mean that the firm is actually going to increase their total revenue by practicing price discrimination. So again, try to think of some groups that you think firms might utilize price discrimination against. In other words, can you think of any places that you go where different people pay different prices than you do for the same exact product? So the first thing that comes to mind for me would be something like senior citizens. Oftentimes when you go to businesses, senior citizens pay a different price than the general population. I know when I go to the grocery store, they have Senior Citizen Day where they get 10% off of their purchase. When I go to a lot of restaurants, senior citizens get a different price than other customers. When I go to the movie theater, senior citizens get a different price. Why is that? In other words, why is the firm practicing price discrimination against senior citizens? Well, number one, it must be that the firms assume that there are different elasticities of demand for the same product. Why would senior citizens have a different elasticity of demand? Usually it would be because they're on a fixed income. The rest of the population isn't. And so when you are on a fixed income, it makes sense that you are going to have more elastic demand than everybody else. In other words, you're going to be more responsive to price changes because you have a fixed level of income that you have to live off of. So therefore, if firms can identify that senior citizens have a different elasticity of demand than everybody else because of that fixed income, they will have an interest in practicing price discrimination. You'll notice that we'll be able to meet the second criteria also for senior citizens because the groups are easily identifiable. In other words, you can ask for identification to actually see their date of birth to ensure that they truly are a senior citizen. You have to keep the groups from trading with each other. So usually when a senior citizen is getting their different price, they're only allowed to purchase one of that item for themselves, so they can't go give it to somebody else. And then, of course, the firm is only going to do it if their total revenue is going to increase. So perhaps if we're talking about a location where senior citizens have a very high level of income, then firms may not have an incentive to practice price discrimination because they wouldn't actually be increasing their overall revenue. But in addition to senior citizens, we can think of other groups of people that firms practice price discrimination against. Students. Oftentimes if you go places, you'll notice that students get different prices than the general population. And again, that would make sense. Students probably have a different elasticity of demand because they generally have a much lower income. They're full-time students, they're not working, so they don't have as much money. Military. Again, military are generally on a fixed income. Families. In other words, firms know that it's more expensive for families to utilize particular services or goods, so they're less likely to, go out. So think of something like a restaurant offering a kids eat free night. That's an example of price discrimination. So again, let's walk us through an example to see how price discrimination would actually play out in the market. Let's say, for example, a local movie theater starts to track the ticket prices and corresponding quantities that are purchased. Let's say they realize that the average senior citizens will purchase 10 movie tickets when the price is $8, and they'll purchase 30 tickets when the price is lowered to $6. And then they do the same price changes for the rest of the population, and they find that they'll purchase 15 tickets when the price is $8 and 20 tickets when the price is $6. So the first thing we need to figure out is do these two groups of people actually have a different elasticity of demand? So you'll recall that we already learned our formula for arc elasticity, where we can take this data and plug the numbers in to figure out what the actual numeric value of the elasticity is, because that's what we need to know whether the demand is elastic, unit elastic, or inelastic. So let's go ahead and do that. So you'll notice that I'm basically doing the same exact problem that we did in previous slides in the previous lecture when we did arc elasticity. The only difference is I'm now doing it for two groups of people. I'm using that same formula for arc elasticity, but I'm doing it for both senior citizens and the rest of the population. So again, you would do the same thing. You would take your data, plug those numbers into the formulas and do the simple math out. So again, for senior citizens, we come up with 1 over 0.286 after we've dropped the negative sign, which means their elasticity of demand in its absolute value is 3.5. So we know that that means their demand is elastic. That is a value that's greater than 1. Therefore, the firm would have an incentive to lower the price for the senior citizens, because we already learned that if your demand is elastic, you need to lower the price in order to get to that unit elastic pricing region. For the rest of the population, when we do the math out, we actually come up with 1, which means demand is already unit elastic, right? If we come up with the number 1, that means demand is unit elastic, which means we do nothing to the price. For the rest of the population, we're already maximizing our revenue flow for everybody else. So we would keep the prices the same and just lower the price for the senior citizen. So in this case, because we did determine that the two different groups of people did indeed have different elasticities of demand, we would want to practice price discrimination. If we had done this and we saw that there was no difference in elasticity of demand, then the firm would have no incentive to practice price discrimination. But in this case, they would. Now, you'll also recall a different way that we could determine that two different groups of people have different elasticities of demand is simply by observing their demand curve. So if we had graphed the demand curves for senior citizens versus total population, we can see that the demand curve for the total population is indeed steeper than the demand curve for senior citizens. So again, remember, the steeper the curve, the more inelastic the demand, the flatter the curve, the more elastic the demand. So we already can tell just by looking at the demand curves that senior citizens do indeed have more elastic demand for movie tickets than everybody else. Okay, so just to recap, again, producers will only decrease their price to increase revenues until they reach the unit elastic price. If they continue to lower their price, then total revenue would start to go back down. And then vice versa. If demand is inelastic, they'll raise their price until they reach that unit elastic zone, because if they continue to raise it more, they'll go back into the elastic region and their revenue will begin to fall. So again, the goal of the firm is to reach this point right here in the middle, set the pricing to maximize their total revenue flow. So if demand is elastic, they lower the price. If demand is inelastic, they raise the price. The last thing that I want to cover in this particular lecture is what determines the price elasticity of demand to begin with. In other words, why is it that for some products we have very elastic demand? In other words, we're very responsive and sensitive to price changes, and for other goods and services we're not. In other words, we don't alter the amount of goods and services that we purchase. And so these are the 3 primary determinants of price elasticity of demand. Number 1 is going to be the existence of substitutes in the market. In other words, the more substitutes that you have as a consumer, the more elastic your demand becomes. Because if the price increases of a good, you can easily not buy that good and buy something else instead. So think about something like gasoline. Gasoline does not have a lot of substitutes. In other words, if you own a vehicle that runs on gas, then you can see why you would have inelastic demand, because the existence of substitutes does not exist. So again, just the existence of substitutes and then how well those substitutes can replace the goods or services that you're purchasing is going to determine how elastic your demand is. The more substitutes, the more elastic. The less substitutes, the more inelastic. The second determinant would be the importance of the product in your overall budget. In other words, the more the item constitutes of your overall budget, the more elastic your demand becomes. So think of something, if you're buying like a new car, that's going to constitute a very large percentage of your overall budget because it's an expensive item. So again, because it represents a significant portion of your overall household income, perhaps like like a 1% increase in the price may actually cause you to put off buying that car. However, think of something like coffee. Coffee constitutes a very small portion of your household's total budget. Therefore, if there was a 1% increase in the price of coffee, it probably wouldn't have any effect on the quantity of coffee that you purchase. So again, the larger the product constitutes of your overall budget, the more elastic your demand becomes for that good. And then the last determinant of demand is simply the time period under consideration. Generally, the shorter the period of time, the more inelastic your demand is. And the longer the time period under consideration, the more elastic your demand is. The reason why if you have a longer period of time, your demand becomes more elastic is because it basically gives you more time to seek out substitute products. Again, the additional time allows consumers to alter their behavior, again, to find the substitute product. So I can even use gasoline as an example of talking about in the short run, because I just own a vehicle that runs on gasoline, I could have very inelastic demand for gasoline. However, in the long run, if new technology becomes available that allows us to fuel our vehicles with something else, or perhaps I purchase a car that utilizes a different fuel source, then my demand for gasoline can become more elastic. So again, the time period under consideration would be our last determinant of price elasticity of demand. The more time you have, the more elastic your demand becomes.